Hello, I'm David Gordon Koch, reporting for the NB Media Co-op. I'm joined today by Christine Saulnier, Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Nova Scotia office. She co-authored a new report titled Atlantic Canada Needs a Raise. There's an article about it on our website, nbmediacoop.org. Christine, thanks for joining the NB Media Co-op today.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity, David.
Can you briefly outline the main findings of this report for us?
Sure. So I'm assuming you want to focus on New Brunswick. I mean, it was all four Atlantic provinces, but we were looking at the data from StatsCan on who works for $20 or less an hour and where do they work and what percentage of workers work for that. And so in New Brunswick, and actually in all Atlantic provinces, we're looking at a third of workers who are earning $20 or less an hour. And in New Brunswick, that's 33% of workers, which is 114,000 plus workers in New Brunswick who are also just being paid $20 or less an hour as they work hard.
Yeah, so over 100,000 workers in New Brunswick alone take home effectively less than a living wage, which is uh, defined sort of generally as, the amount needed to enjoy a decent quality of life and avoid severe financial stress. And so this there's a range, I guess, depending on where you are and yeah, the cost of living in your city or area, but it's at least in New Brunswick above $20 an hour, isn't it?
It is, yeah. The lowest I think in New Brunswick is in Bathurst. It's 21 something an hour in Bathurst. Actually, that was 2023 numbers. So we're all working on the 2024 calculations that'll be out in September for the living wage. And yeah, absolutely. So those wages are based on costs in communities and do reflect, not just costs, but actually what public services are available, what government income supports are available, what people pay in terms of taxes and payroll and all of payroll inputs, CPP, all of that is in there. And so when we look at the gap between the calculated living wages and the minimum wage, those are very significant gaps from 21 to what, 15 and 10, 20, 30 cents in New Brunswick. Like it's a huge gap and likely to grow, I assume, in September, given that inflation still hasn't abated.
And I guess for some people who might not face this kind of as you say severe financial stress, I think is the phrase in the report. Um, can you talk about what that looks like in practice? What are the kind of decisions, tough decisions that working class, working poor families have to make in these conditions?
Absolutely. When we look at a budget for a household, what's the quote unquote discretionary spending? Once you've paid for housing, which, if you want a roof over your head, has to be your priority first and foremost. And then what's left? Well, for many families, there's very little. They are now looking at their food budget as discretionary. I mean, it shouldn't be, but people are making very difficult choices, just even in terms of what they're buying in the grocery store. And then what else do we have to purchase? I mean, there's more than that, right? Just basic household costs don't seem to be on anybody's radar. But the last time I looked, all of those costs are also very expensive, whatever you're buying at the drugstore, for example. And that's not even the drugs, right? It's all the other things that we need monthly in our households. But people are making choices around electricity, around prescription drugs, making choices that are often impacting their health. The kind of stress that people are under who are don't know whether this is the month that they can't make the rent. This is the month where maybe they're cutting their pills in half or skipping days or whatever it is. I mean, that stress alone has a tremendous impact on people's health, both physical and mental. I mean, people assume that that's just a mental health impact, but that's a huge physical impact. When you're under this stress, the flight or fight your body can't cope. And we know that that's not just about income. So the income has this compounding effect, right? If you're not purchasing the nutritional value food that you need, you're maybe in housing that's not the best quality, all of that is impacting your health too. But the stress is another layer of impact on your health.
Mm,
And so that's why we see higher chronic diseases for people who are struggling in lower income, and specifically those who are obviously struggling in deeper poverty. But this group that we're talking about, the working poor, even though it's not even poor in the sense of our poverty lines, but it is definitely people are struggling.
mhm.
It's very difficult choices.
Yeah, and what you were saying just now about the health effects of this severe financial stress also implies costs on the healthcare system, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yes. We fortunately do have a universal public health care system, and given the impact that income has on health, and that these kinds of struggles have on health, it does show up in the data that people who are lower income do tend to use actually more expensive healthcare, so emergency room access more than primary care. And that has to do with, also, this is the group that has the least ability to take the time out of work, often don't have paid sick time, don't have personal leave days, aren't actually able to get to their doctor for preventative health care. Like, there are so many reasons why it's not just income, it's actually the conditions of their life, which means they are the most sort of time crunched people as well. That means the impact on our healthcare system is a significant cost. I mean, we did the calculations in terms of the cost of poverty. Geez, I'm not sure what the last year was. And that is one of the significant components of that costing.
I did a brief review of some of the recent job openings, looking at Indeed.com, of jobs that pay less than a living wage in New Brunswick. And some examples briefly: a carpet air duct and water technician in Fredericton at $16 to $20 an hour, a hotel receptionist in Bathurst from $16 an hour, a shipper receiver job in Moncton for $18 an hour. Warehouse workers were among them. I a few years ago met a garbage picker, someone who works for the sanitation service, of a private company that replaced the public service QP workers in the city of Moncton. And he was making about $15 an hour to ride around on the back of a truck picking up garbage. Um, Really an essential service. I I was interested to see, you had narrowed down the industries with the greatest concentration of low paid workers. Can you outline those findings briefly? I think that they're similar across the provinces, aren't they?
Yes, and you've pointed to the jobs that fall underneath the industries. They are similar. There are some differences across the province, but the two top ones. So by top, I mean when we look at the percentage of workers in those industries who earn $20 or less an hour, the top one across all provinces in Atlantic Canada is accommodation and food services. And in New Brunswick, that's 84% of those workers are being paid $20 or less an hour. And then it's 69% for the second, and that's retail trade. And some of the other ones that you mentioned, I think that's the third, the business building and other support services. That's the garbage pickup, that's administrative support positions. Though those positions could also be in healthcare or education and across the board. And then the fourth in New Brunswick is actually agriculture, with fishing being the fifth, which is a little different than other provinces. But you get an idea of what those industries are, that where so it's different from incidence to prevalence. So this is really looking at, in this industry, what percentage of workers are earning $20 or less an hour. And yeah, some of those numbers are significant. When you're looking at 85% of workers in accommodation and food services, very few workers there are being paid more than $20 an hour. And when we think back to those living wages, I mean, one thing I'll say is we didn't actually pull the data for living wage. Well, we'd have to pick what living wage, But even just looking at median wage in New Brunswick, which is, actually don't have it at the top of my head, but last time I looked at it, is probably around your highest median, which likely means 50% of your workers are earning, less than a living wage. So yeah, this is, a spotlight on what $20 or less is an hour. And I think the red flag for me is when we get to 1/3 of workers, then we really are looking at a structurally low-waged economy.
Now, here in New Brunswick in 2021, uh, you may recall the government of Premier Blaine Higgs implemented a 5 cent minimum wage that was based on the Consumer Price Index. This was widely panned at the time, uh, at which time New Brunswick's minimum wage was the lowest in Canada, and there was considerable pressure from organized labor, anti-poverty groups, especially during the COVID-19 crisis when there was more talk about the importance of essential workers and so on. Um, After this, the government announced a series of $1 increases. When the first $2 increase over 2 years was announced in December 2021, the Higgs government said it would be the biggest increase in 40 years. Later, they announced another $1 increase. Now we're back to increases indexed to inflation, which have brought the minimum wage above $15 an hour for the first time. I guess, how would you respond to someone who says, well, the government of New Brunswick has already done enough with with this kind of significant bump over the past few years?
Mm. Well, I mean, I think the living wage tells you one thing, right? As a benchmark wage, it does tell you that the minimum, the gap to the living is still very significant. The fact that those increases happen, and of course they're historic. Look historically at what happened to minimum wages. I know in my province of Nova Scotia, ours peaked in 1977 and didn't reach the 1977 level till 2018. Like we only just started increasing minimum wages to, for most provinces, even reflect inflation. And remember, when we're adjusting for inflation, we're adjusting for last year's inflation rate, right? Like people are having to wait a whole year to adjust to an inflation rate that they've been dealing with for a year. So that's one problem of just adjusting to inflation. But the
On,
other, sorry,
on
go
on
ahead,
that
David.
note, you mentioned that that was the highest in 1977. What would that be in today's terms?
Yes. So, I looked, and I was trying to figure out how to represent that, and so I took $20 and put it in to the Bank of Canada's inflationary calculator. $20 in 1977, it would be worth 90. So let me rephrase that. What you
Sure.
could purchase for $20 in 1977 would cost $96 today. And so what that means and what I said previously in terms of the peak is adjusted for inflation, we reached 1977 minimum wage in 2018. When you think about, like, people will say, well, the minimum wage in 1977 was, well, I think it was 275 in Nova Scotia, probably very similar in New Brunswick, right? Well, okay, but what could you purchase
Mhm.
for that? And how does that compare to today? Workers are just running in place because between 1977 and really the year, uh, maybe even in the 2000s before we started seeing increases in the minimum, it meant that that minimum was stagnating and eroding, moreover. Right? The inflation was just eroding it all those years where governments were just letting the minimum erode. And so we're just starting to make some gains. And obviously, we're now having to play some catch up. That's why we're at a place where we see this huge gap. That gap represents both wages on the side of wages, but it also represents what's been happening on the cost side. And that includes underinvestment by successive decades of governments, whether that's in housing, public or broader public services, healthcare, childcare, you name it. And so here we are. And so our demands likely look radical and significant. But as you say, I mean, we've been saying these things for decades now. Decades we've been calling for investment in nonprofit housing. Decades we've been saying you need to expand public health care. We know we've been eroding how much coverage public health care has for what we need, with more and more of us having to pay more and more out of pocket. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to figure out how to put these things into context so people understand what the struggle is about today.
Mm. Yeah, and there's a lot of counter arguments and that you address in your paper. Um, and one of those it has to do um, with this idea that young people and students who live with their parents are the ones who are typically in this kind of job, and so because they're living with their parents and they depend on them, they live in their house, they don't have the same cost of living, they don't need a higher minimum wage. What does the
Mhm.
data say?
Yeah. Well, the data on who is working under $20 an hour tells us that, and I'll just tell you what New Brunswick's is, 86% of those workers are not students. 85% of those workers are over the age of 20. I do want to just say that, um, I don't think we should be making any assumptions about teenagers or students. Either now we put it in there because, as you say, this is the way that industry distracts us from maybe a more policy related discussion about what the purpose of the minimum wage is. I'm not sure. So I'm actually not suggesting that students or teens shouldn't earn a living wage.
Mm,
I actually, and in having done policy roundtables with people who are living in poverty, we actually know that some of those teens are paying the power bills, and definitely some of those students are. And there's a difference between definitely a 15-year-old and a 20-year-old likely. And the 20-year-old student is likely facing what is one more underinvestment in public services, and that is very, very high, obviously, tuition costs.
mhm,
So I don't think we should be making assumptions about who is working in these wages. It's the only time that we ever hear our employers talk about their workers and who those workers might be. But they don't also take into account the fact that we have the feminization of poverty, and we have more women working in these low wage jobs, or we have more racialized people, and we have new immigrants and all of that. Like I wade into this because I think we do need some data that shows us, and that doesn't just look at the sliver of low wage workers as just those working minimum. I mean, I think that's the other side.
mm,
If you were to pull the data on just the minimum, you would find more teenagers than what we pulled. But again, I don't think we should be making assumptions about what happens in a family and who's contributing to what, especially not these days, given
yeah.
given how difficult things are. So sorry, long
Uh,
answer, but I think it is important to put into context why we've even put those numbers in there. I mean, I definitely think it's important to disaggregate data and have a look at who's working there. I mean, the other part of the data that we pulled is obviously this other notion that these are seasonal part-time jobs. And I think that's actually super compelling data to see that the percentage that are working full-time jobs who are earning $20 or less in New Brunswick is 71%. 81% say that they earn $20 or less an hour and they're in a permanent job. Those are those are really important data points as well.
mm. Yeah, so it's interesting to see how, as you say, speaking to social workers in Moncton, for example, there's many cases of uh, young people, teenagers, in broken homes who are on their own trying to get an apartment in the very very tight housing market, for example. And then on the other hand, if we are talking in the cases of post-secondary students, very very high debt loads that people are graduating with. So
Yes,
Uh,
absolutely. And I'll just note that our living wage budget includes no debt.
mhm,
Like even when we look at those living wage rates, understand that those are actually fairly conservative estimate of
mhm.
what people need, and they do not include debt.
And you mentioned briefly the feminization of poverty, and just bringing up the statistics for New Brunswick here. And actually, women were more likely to be found in these low wage, $20 less, or under $20 an hour jobs in every province uh, that you studied, the four Atlantic provinces. 54% of New Brunswickers in low wage jobs were women, for example. So, could you just elaborate briefly on the feminization of poverty and what that means?
Well, and I think it's really looking at issues of pay equity and inequity, and we still do see women who are in predominantly low-waged work, or who perform who predominantly perform low-wage work in that, all of the sectors that you can think of. That's also about what kind of work do we value as a society, or as a labor market, or as employers. I mean, that's a structural issue, and that's why, we talk about why we need a higher minimum wage, but also why we need very strong pay equity legislation that doesn't just apply to the public sector, but applies to the private sector, because that's the only way that we can get at these structural discriminatory ways that we value certain types of work over others. And so that's part of why we see women in those lower wage jobs, is just that. I mean, the other side, of course, is if we were to look at male-dominated jobs, those are difficult jobs to break into for women, and they're often still very difficult workplaces for women. And we're still seeing that occupational segregation that's happening. And the other thing that happens is, even when we have well, we actually see men entering more female-dominated workplaces. They tend to have this class, I don't know what we call it, the escalator up.
Mhm.
And so we see more men who enter, say, nursing or other female-dominated professions, and they make their way to the top much quicker than women in those professions too. So there's still lots of work we need to be doing on those the inequities in our labor force. I would have loved to dig into more disaggregated data. As I say, it is difficult to get that at a provincial level, and not just racialized, but also Indigenous, because we know generally, if we were to look at census data, we do see those groups also predominant, like more disproportionately working in lower wage jobs as well, and that is about discrimination.
And so, going back to the debate over a significantly higher minimum wage, um, one of the arguments that industry typically makes is that a significantly higher minimum wage would essentially bankrupt a number of small or medium mom and pop businesses. So, how would you respond to that argument?
Well, I think part of it is pulling the data that says that a significant proportion of these workers who are earning $20 or less are actually working in what I would not call mom and pop, are working in businesses that have 100+ employees. In New Brunswick, that's 52%. So at least half of them are working in those I would call larger employers. And so it's important that we think about leveling the playing field. So in other words, we often know that our smaller local businesses can compete very well on quality of product, and the fact that they are local. We know that they do try and pay their workers above minimum wage, but when you have other larger employers who are competing for those workers too, I mean, it gets difficult. One way to do that is to level it up, so that you take this, at least part of this equation out, and then perhaps the quality of your product stand out even more, and you're able to do that. It, the other part of the argument around, business will go bankrupt, is actually just looking at the evidence that we now have. There was once upon a time when industry as well as progressive economists would have been doing these theoretical modeling about what might the impact be. Anecdotal interventions by businesses saying if you raise it by X, I mean, you can do media searches for, it doesn't matter if it's 5 cents or whatever it is. Businesses say that the sky is going to fall and their businesses will all go bankrupt. We now have real data in jurisdictions in Canada, in the United States, side by side jurisdictions, often in the United States in particular, that saw very significant increases to the minimum wage and did not see the, saw little to no effect on jobs being lost, even in those sectors where we see the low wage workers concentrated in, and actually saw some stimulation of the economy and job growth.
That's an interesting
Real
point.
evidence.
Can you elaborate on this idea of that, people with more money, like working class people with more money in their pockets will spend, and then that could actually boost the economy? Is this a valid argument?
Yeah, I mean, it is. It is even just in a common sense way, but of course, now we have data that tells us this. Our employers are having to make choices, obviously. This is about supply and demand, and it is not this simplistic argument where you increase labor costs and suddenly they're just going to equally increase the cost of their services. They need the lineup out the door, right? They need people
Mhm.
to actually be buying their services and their products. And those very employees that they're employing are customers, whether of theirs or some other business. And so I mean, that's part of what we're saying is it's not that simplistic, but at the same time, who are your consumers? And then once we look at the fact that if we stimulate lower income people, so we give them more money in their pockets, and there's lots of evidence about the impact of this. Also seems common sense, but there it is.
Mhm.
We produce the evidence. You give people who are on the lower end of the income scale more money, they have pent up demand, just like we just said. They actually need to spend it. They've been wanting to spend it, but they haven't had it to spend on essentials. They will be the ones that are spending. They won't
Mhm.
be taking that money and purchasing a cruise or investing it overseas or in fact saving it, because we know that that class actually doesn't save and isn't able to save as much as our higher class. It's going into the economy. That is what will happen with the additional income when when it goes to lower income people. Like the positive ripple effects of stimulating the economy from the bottom, we absolutely underestimate, likely because of what we hear from industry about like the negative ripple effects that
Mhm.
might happen if we do this. But it is compelling to think about it the other way around, right? And the fact that
Yeah.
a perpetual low wage economy where we're stagnating wages is negative. It is negative for those very same businesses who are making these arguments.
Yeah, I guess, conceivably, you could see more, money, going into small local businesses where people are spending their hard-earned cash, and less money going into interest payments to Visa or Mastercard, as people are accumulating debt on one hand, or perhaps less money going to offshore tax havens of extremely rich employers on the other.
Yes. Yes, we need to be making those connections. But even just the fact that lower income people, fewer of them do own cars, fewer of them are at your big box stores outside of the city as well. They're more likely to be
Mm.
shopping nearer to where they live, and many of those businesses do tend to be smaller than having to figure out how to get out to the big box store too. So there is that side as well.
And just wrapping up here, the effect on prices is another sort of boogeyman, or fear that people have. This fear that, for example, if workers at fast food restaurants, again, restaurants and accommodations, one of the big categories of low
Yep.
paid low wage job employers, if these workers had a much higher minimum wage? Would regular consumers be increasingly unable, more and more stretched when it comes to affording little luxuries like, maybe a fast food lunch or things of that nature? What does the evidence tell us about that?
I think there's I'll say the flippant thing that comes to the top of my head first, and which is, if we were all paid less, would prices go down? No. There isn't this simple cause and effect between prices, between wages and prices. Businesses are making decisions. They make decisions about that price point based on whether, how much can they push that price up. And yes, some of the labor costs obviously are reflected in their output costs. What is your input cost? What can you possibly charge? Where's your profit margin? All of that is figuring into a business model and business choices. But it's not just that you're going to increase by this amount. That labor bill for many businesses isn't as large as we are suggesting. Think about the workers and the actual amount of income that we're talking about. That's one side of things. Macroeconomic effects probably affect that price more. So think about, I don't know, climate crisis and climate change in countries where we're getting our coffee from, as an example,
Mm.
so-called free trade agreements and all of that. Businesses are making a choice about how much of that can be passed on, but generally the passing on can't be significant because they simply can't sustain it. I mean, it could mean at the end of the day that a business does choose to do that. Whether they stay in business or not after doing that is a good question,
Mm.
right? The numbers that I'm talking to you about are aggregate. So if a business chooses to raise its prices to a place where customers are no longer willing to pay for their product because it isn't quality worth that price, then that will impact that business. But they have made a choice as well. And that choice is also, again, about balancing that recruitment and retention of those workers who are providing services that figure into whether or not you and I find that there's a quality product or service there, right? Like what we've started out talking about is you have a worker who's coming in totally stressed out, their health is being impacted because they can't afford their bills, versus you have a worker coming in who's paid a living wage, feels valued and rewarded, is able to give what they, a different kind of maybe service to that employer. Plus, they're likely to be more loyal. Plus, they take less sick days if they even get access to them at all. All of that has an impact on a business's bottom line. It's very short-sighted and it's very simplistic. Obviously, for us to just suggest that an increase in wages means an increase in costs. And guess who that benefits? The more and more we believe that we don't deserve an increase in wages because at the end of the day, we'll be paying more, only benefits those who are making those other choices and actually padding their pockets, or maybe their CEOs getting another couple of million or whatever is happening.
Well, thank you so much, Christine. I've been speaking to Christine Saunier, director of the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, Nova Scotia office. She co-authored a new report titled "Atlantic Canada Needs a Raise." Again, you can see an article about it on our website, nbmediacoop.org, and the study itself is linked there as well. Uh, Christine, thanks so much for speaking to the NB Media Co-op today.
Thanks for the opportunity.